Okay, now I was going to move into Stalin today, but I had second thoughts. I think Stalin deserves his own day. Besides, I thought we left a lot of kind of dangling participles the other day. I mean, it's an immense subject. It's an important one. It's also complicated and, of course, controversial. I left out certain facts that are usually cited as key. One of them, I mean, this is the thing, is like there's what people thought they knew 40 years ago, what they thought they knew 20 years ago, and what they know now. Now, the traditional argument among the kind of anti-Keynesians was that one of the biggest mistakes Hoover made was signing into law a big new tariff on imported goods. This was in June of 1930, a tariff of about 60%. So this leads to this whole argument about free trade versus protectionism, the idea being that it killed off transatlantic trade, thus eventually leading to the collapse of these banks in Austria and Germany and a kind of domino effect. And you heard that a lot, particularly from the so-called Chicago school, the kind of anti-Keynesians. The more people have looked into the problem, though, the more they have determined that this, too, is probably a red herring. I mean, in a way, both the Keynesians and the anti-Keynesians have been wrong about a lot of the big facts. Keynes, the big supposed innovation that he published in The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, a book published in 1936. This was kind of his masterwork. The phrase you sometimes hear is pump priming. That is the government trying to stimulate the economy artificially. So the Keynesians said, this is the mistake Hoover made, that he didn't do enough to stimulate the economy through deficit spending, whereas FDR did. And that doesn't fit the facts at all. In fact, neither does the argument about the tariff, because, in fact, foreign trade was a minuscule part of the U.S. economy. Now, it did have, to some extent, a detrimental effect on Europe, but if you look at the dates, it just doesn't fit. The German recession actually began in 1928-29, so Germany's economy had already gone into recession long before this, long before the Wall Street crash. In fact, Germany's economy plunging into recession might have even had an impact on the Wall Street crash. So this doesn't make sense. The thing about pump priming doesn't really make sense either. If you look at public spending, I talked about how Hoover, too, believed in this, if you remember. There were public works projects. He gave a lot of money to farmers. He put money into construction. He ran a deficit of almost $2.5 billion in 1931. In the last 2 years of the Hoover administration, the deficit, that is, the percentage of money the government was spending in excess of receipts, was a little bit less than 5% of gross domestic product. To put that into comparison to today's terms, it's significant. Like in America's economy today, it's about a $14–15 trillion economy, so 5% of GDP would be about $700 billion. It's a pretty large deficit. Of course, it's much smaller than the actual one today, which is 1.7 trillion. But in other words, Hoover was running substantial deficits. And FDR, as I said, was not really a Keynesian. He had certain ideas, but none of them were really kind of soundly based in economic theory. He tried a bunch of stuff. Some of it was the same stuff Hoover had done. Some was a little different. But he didn't really increase public spending all that much. In fact, deficit spending in the FDR years peaked at about 5.6% in 1934. So in other words, just marginally larger. Like in today's terms, it went up from maybe about $650 billion to maybe like $800 billion, and then it started going down again. So in other words, he did, to some extent, a little more of what Hoover was doing, but not all that much more. So that argument doesn't really make sense either. The stuff I talked about the other day was more about the causes of the Depression, which again is still kind of a mystery. I mean, if you remember the chart from the other day about stock prices plunging, this graph here has what happens to, essentially the indices in industrial production. That is manufacturing and heavy industry and so on. And here you can see the US line is the one on the bottom. It drops by literally almost 50% between 1921 and 1931. Now, other sectors were even worse. This is like the overall index of industrial production. So something happened that, again, has never really been adequately explained. It may just have been a matter of a snowball effect. It may even have been something as simple as this. The stock market was falling already, and at some point it should have leveled out. But in fact, Hoover turned into this kind of almost like a judgmental moralist. He was always denouncing the stock market and telling people not to speculate in stocks, kind of almost talking down the stock market. So that might have had something to do with it. His meddling in wages, the corporatist idea, that is, of getting employers to raise wages, which he bragged about in 1932. He said, our wages are now the highest in the world. That was at the height of the Great Depression. So that might have had something to do with it. But it may just have been a universal collapse of confidence. It may have had to do with the imbalances I talked about, relating to reparations payments and the debt overhang. It may have been that all of the central bankers were trying really hard to kind of inflate the global economy with all of these loans, and it just stopped working. No one really knows why it stopped. The more interesting question for a lot of economists, though, is how it ended. That is, how the Depression supposedly ended, how the recovery began. And even here, again, you have variants of the argument. The anti-Keynesians will basically say, well, there wasn't a recovery. The Smoot-Hawley tariff and all of the kind of restrictions on economic activity and excessive regulation slowed down the recovery. That's what they say. And that doesn't entirely fit the facts either, because you can see there was a recovery. The U.S. did begin to recover at some point around the end of 1932, 1933. Interestingly, the Germans began to recover at almost exactly the same time. Now, there may have been a direct connection. The U.S. banks were so important in the German economy, it was natural that one thing might lead to the other. Now, this is kind of significant because when it comes to politics, you can't really overemphasize the role of luck and timing. There's an old saw, it's better to be lucky than to be good. It wasn't just FDR who got lucky. That is because he came to office right as the economy was about to recover. Maybe he helped it recover, maybe not, but he benefited from the recovery. So too did Hitler, and we're going to look at that next week. And it was definitely not. In Hitler's case, we pretty much know for sure that the economic policies which helped turn around the German economy had already been enacted before he came to office. So Hitler benefited very directly from this recovery. FDR did as well. On the other hand, what kind of recovery it is. When the economy basically drops by about 50%, you'd think at some point it just kind of has to recover, right? What goes down has to go up. So even though you talked about this recovery, and it looks very dramatic, it wasn't even until 1941 that gross domestic product, that is the overall production of the economy, actually passed 1929 levels. And that was in dollar terms, and by then the dollar had been devalued. So in a sense, it didn't really pass this level in inflation-adjusted dollars until later on in the Second World War. So that's why some of these arguments are, again, it's like people arguing past each other without quite hitting the target. The idea even that there was a great recovery is itself controversial. There was some kind of recovery, yes. But as to what it entailed, again, I think we can probably dismiss the tariff. It mattered somewhat. It didn't help cross-Atlantic trade. But as far as particularly the volume of the U.S. economy, foreign trade was so small. It was less than 5%. It cannot have had much effect on the U.S. economy. Slightly more maybe on Europe. Now the pump priming argument, again, it just doesn't fit the facts. FDR, there were a few new programs. A lot of them were just, extended versions of Hoover programs. A lot of them were well publicized. There would be things like he would try to put artists to work. Artists would receive federal money to produce paintings. Usually of a kind of a public, almost political nature. Certain kind of conservation corps efforts were in swing, where they would get young people to try to clean up the streets. There were a lot of high-profile endeavors. But overall, it did not really matter very much as far as the economy. The only really substantive difference in terms of like a qualitative difference in philosophy between FDR and Hoover is that Hoover, for all of his efforts to intervene in the economy, did not believe in welfare. That is, in actually paying people not to work. They had a phrase for that in the old days. They called it going on the dole. Going on the dole was sort of like a shameful thing. It meant you could no longer find a job, you couldn't work, and so you're being paid not to work. We usually just refer to this these days as welfare. Now, there were a couple of these programs enacted under FDR, but they were not enacted until rather later. The biggest and the most important of them was the Social Security Act of 1935. There was also an act called Aid to Families with Dependent Children. It's usually contracted as AFDC. Now, what this basically meant was that particularly single mothers or mothers whose husbands had died would receive money to help them raise a family. And the thing about both of these ideas, this is basically old age insurance, pensions, the kind of thing that every country has these days, but back then not everyone did. Both of these acts, they were significant in terms of their impact on certain people's lives, but they were not significant as far as the overall economy. That's not true today. Social Security is enormous today, and you've probably heard about this, the kind of pension overhang that everyone is worried about in Europe and the United States, largely because of the demographic crux. In the end, it basically is a Ponzi scheme. It's a Ponzi scheme because it's predicated on an ever-expanding population. In fact, when they first enacted this, the age at which you would receive benefits, the retirement age, they pegged at 62 years old. No, I'm sorry, it was 65. 62 was average life expectancy. That is, most people died at 62. And that's why the benefits kicked in at 65, because they didn't want to bankrupt the government, basically. Now, today, of course, life expectancy is closer to 80, and many people live into their 90s, which is one of the reasons why the system is effectively bankrupt. Right now, in fact, it's going bankrupt rather rapidly, because the age 65, if you do some simple math, this is 2011. So people who are turning 65 this year were born in what year? Is anyone good at math? 1946. Height of the baby boom after the Second World War. So you have this humongous bulge in population. They're all going to be retiring and demanding benefits. So the more serious people now want to index this to old age. Well, anyway, over the long run, these measures were actually very important. Like AFDC was very controversial in the Clinton years, because by then it had become clear that to a certain extent, it had given women an incentive to have children. And many women were having children just to get the benefits. And so Clinton, actually, this is one of the ways in which he was, kind of a Democrat who reached across to the other side. He actually ended the welfare benefits in 1996. So anyway, these acts, they were important politically in the long run. In the short run, economically, they were not very significant. They had very little impact on the economy. Now, particularly the old age pensions, because there just weren't that many people aged 65. It was nice, that is, for people who got the benefits, but it had very little kind of a stimulatory effect on the economy. It was controversial politically. In the long run, FDR obviously won, and these programs became very popular. Now, there were some things he did, though, which were significant. His first sort of 3 months in office is usually referred to as the 100 days. Now, this is a little bit like, again, you remember the 100 days of Napoleon. It's unlike it, too, because it's now almost a cliche. When a president is first in office, the idea is that's when he is kind of most popular, he has the most authority, so he should try to get as much done as possible. And that's kind of what FDR did. Some of what allowed him to do this, aside from the fact that he had huge Democratic majorities in Congress, both houses of Congress, which Hoover had not enjoyed, part of what allowed him to do this was there was this huge gap between the elections and the time he actually took office. Now, in the old days, partly because of communications and transport, it took a very long time for a president with all of his kind of staff and people to move to Washington to, just like transfer the administration. So there was a really long time between his being elected and his actually taking office. And this time happened to coincide with basically like the lowest moment, the trough of the Depression. So that, again, he was partly fortunate in the timing, but it also made things a little bit more dramatic, in that Hoover wanted FDR's help as the president-elect, that is, to help him, take measures regarding the banks, for example, because there was a panic in the banks. And FDR, with kind of political shrewdness, decided not to cooperate. Not necessarily that he wanted the economy to get worse, but he wanted there to be a sharp break between Hoover and himself, so that, yes, he would be able to take the credit. So like right towards the end of this interim period, Hoover and FDR, basically Hoover's people came up with a plan to close the banks, what they call a bank holiday. which is literally just physically closing them so you can't go to them. The idea being this prevents people from going and taking out their deposits. I mean, it's a very dramatic thing. It's like suddenly money was not circulating in the economy. A lot of people had to resort to barter for a week, or even in some places longer than a week. Students, for example, when they would go to the cafeteria, I guess they didn't have the tickets that we have here, at least the faculty have them. They would sort of like, issue IOUs. I promise to pay you for this food. And, the universities, if they were willing to do that, would do it. Other universities demanded cash payment. But you couldn't get cash from the banks, and so most people just had to resort to kind of improvisation. And, it was the kind of thing which sounded horrible. On the other hand, there was a lot of cooperation and kind of almost a feeling of solidarity and collective suffering. And it probably did help to restore confidence. I mean, what they did is instead of opening all the banks at once, they went through and they tried to figure out which banks were sound, which should be allowed to fail, and so on. And so gradually they allowed the banks to reopen, and confidence, to some extent, at least confidence in the banks was restored. All that means is that people started putting their money back in the banks, before they'd been taking it out, like putting it at home, or as we call it, under the mattress. So it was a good idea, and it basically did work. It wasn't really FDR's idea, but he got the credit for it. And because he waited, he kind of waited for the right bounce in the right moment. Now, again, all of this kind of public works projects, we're going to put people to work, and we're going to have a civilian conservation corps. We're going to have artists and writers working for the government. None of that stuff really had much of an effect. A couple of things he did do, though, did have a dramatic effect. My favorite, actually, is that he ended prohibition. This is a curious fact that I didn't mention before. Between 1919 and 1933, alcohol was forbidden in the United States. Crazy as that sounds, it's not a Muslim country. But there was always an element of this, obviously, in some Christian sects. Like, about the Mormons, for example. The Mormons are also against alcohol, along with tobacco and basically any kind of stimulant. Some of the impulse behind this actually came from women. In fact, the original Prohibition Amendment was passed almost simultaneously with the amendment giving women the right to vote. It wasn't quite so neat as that. In fact, women did not get the right to vote until the year after they published Prohibition. But there was a kind of relation, and it was basically because a lot of these women's organizations for years had been angry about basically men, drinking the salary away, men, some of them obviously beating their wives, this and that. It tended to be women who were behind Prohibition. But in the end, there were enough men who were of a kind of stern Christian bent, who went along with this. Now, there was gross hypocrisy. If you've seen any of those movies or television serials about the 1920s, you might have heard of Al Capone, the bootleggers. Like if you've watched, the Godfather movies, they're talking about, I used to run molasses in from Havana for your father. We ran molasses in from Canada. What's molasses? I mean, it's like pekmez. It's sugar, basically. Like they're smuggling sugar in so they can make booze. And that's how they made their money. And this is really what led, in fact, to the mafia in America. There really wasn't a big-time mafia before Prohibition. You had your Italian mafia, Godfather, obviously. You had a Jewish mafia. You had an Irish mafia. You even had a black mafia, although they weren't quite as visible yet, but they eventually emerged. Like if you've seen that movie, American Gangster. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it all basically goes back to the 1920s. This is when they developed their criminal networks to, smuggle in alcohol. So again, it sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't a small thing. FDR simply ended Prohibition, by executive act. I forget the exact legal mechanism, but it was something to do with declaring it, I think, unconstitutional. And so immediately, suddenly, you could legally buy and sell booze. There's an interesting parallel to this in Russia, of all places. Not a lot of people knew this, but one of the first things that Gorbachev did in 1985, thinking we need to catch up to the West and the capitalists, he prohibited alcohol. In Russia. If you can imagine how well that went over. I mean, literally, they were plowing under vineyards. They were destroying farms and fields that were producing, grapes. And eventually this led, of course, to, the massive use of what the Russians call samagon, which is like this horrendous sort of bathtub gin vodka-like substance that tastes like rat piss, basically. I was forced to drink it once. I don't recommend it. And, the Russians being Russians, they would do things like sniff, sniff glue and like airplane fuel and horrible things like that. No, in America, it wasn't quite like that. In America, you had bootleggers. You had people basically like making their own version of like bathtub whiskey. And then you had, of course, a lot of hypocrisy. I mean, the White House, they served alcohol in the White House, even though it was illegal in the country. So the president was serving drinks. There was gross hypocrisy all around, but the fact is ending prohibition, I think, if nothing else, just improved the national mood. Because, I mean, think about it. It's like you're in misery and you're not even allowed to drink, and now you're allowed to drink, so everyone's mood kind of improves. So that was significant. That was in April 1933. Now, one other thing FDR did in that month, I think, was probably even more significant. And at first it was quiet, and then they eventually announced it and turned it into a big policy. They took the U.S. off the gold standard. Now it's interesting because this has emerged as almost like the latest orthodoxy about the Great Depression. As I said, the anti-Keynesians talking about protectionism and things like that, that argument has mostly been discredited. The Keynesian argument about pump priming doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. But the more sort of, shall we say, orthodox argument now about either what caused it or at the very least what allowed the economies to recover, it had to do with this notion of the archaic gold standard, an antiquated relic. They called it gold fetters, like chains almost. What the gold standard literally meant was, well, in practice for you or me, it meant that theoretically you could take your dollars and exchange them for gold at a fixed rate. In practice, as I think I did explain the other day, since the First World War, there hadn't been a real gold standard. It was like a central bank's gold standard. It was supposed to govern the issue of money, that is, credit. The amount of money in circulation had to be backed by gold so that banks were limited in what they could do to create credit, that is, to inflate the economy. Now, what it meant to go off the gold standard then was, basically what they did is they printed money. They printed about $3 billion. That is not backed by gold, just physical money printing. Now, eventually, they went further than this. This is what they did right around April 1933. FDR slowly, over the course of the next months, developed a policy which was, it was very FDR. It was kind of, charming and crackpot, but also kind of weirdly effective. What he did was, he would get together with a couple of his advisors, one of whom was basically like a farmer. He brought a lot of intellectuals to Washington. They called it a brain trust. But in the end, he didn't really trust most of them. He would usually trust some eccentric guy who told funny, like, homespun stories. And so this guy convinced him that what the U.S. should basically do is start buying gold. So what they would do is they call these they're sort of like egg breakfasts or gold breakfasts. Literally in the morning, they would determine what that day's price of gold would be. By which they meant, this is the price at which we will buy gold. Okay, so what does it mean? The U.S. government is now buying gold. With what? With dollars. So what they're doing is devaluing the dollar, basically. They are raising the price of gold. Literally, they just decide, okay, gold is $31 an ounce today. Tomorrow, it will be $32 an ounce. It wasn't quite that precise. It would be more like, literally, FDR would have fun just throwing out random numbers. Like, tomorrow, it shall be $32.87 an ounce. And then the day after, it will be $32.91 an ounce. They went up gradually, but they really did just literally determine the price of gold like this. Eventually, the price of gold settled at around this amount, $35 an ounce, roughly. This is like by the end of 1933, 1934. Now, did this policy work? Again, the new sort of orthodox interpretation of the Great Depression is that it did. If you look at this graph, the author, it's an interesting guy. He's not an economist. He used to work in investment banking. His name is LECTURE11. It's not really his idea, though. He's actually channeling the theories of a Berkeley economist called Barry Eichengreen. Eichengreen, incidentally, just wrote an editorial yesterday in the Wall Street Journal about... Was there something you weren't sure about or you're pointing to? Oh, I did write his name. Okay, yeah, Eichengreen. Right. He's the sort of theoretical muscle, you might say, behind this new orthodoxy. He's the one who convinced everyone of this interpretation. And so this is basically the idea. Recovery in each country only began after it left the gold standard. It doesn't work for Germany, though, because Germany did not leave the gold standard. Germany's own hands were tied by something more than just gold fetters. Germany's hands were tied by the fact that they'd just undergone hyperinflation. And so the government was like very, very careful about not reinflating the currency. But in the case of the US, UK, and France, it makes sense to some extent. The French didn't really abandon gold until 1935. And you can see on this map they started to grow then. But on the other hand, they were still below where they were in 1933, so I don't know if that really makes sense. The US, it's not precise. I mean, the US economy basically bottomed out, as I said, right before FDR took office, so that this helped. The reason it helped is basically this. You had real deflation. It wasn't just a bugaboo, it wasn't just a theory. Deflation meaning basically it's like a negative inflation rate, right? Prices are dropping instead of rising. It was somewhere around 10% in 1932. That is, prices across the board, if you average all of them, things like food, fuel, housing, etc., were actually dropping. Now, the rate remained negative in FDR's first year in office. It didn't go into positive terms until 1934, when it got up to about 4.3%. And after that, it sort of vaguely stabilized. Now, this in itself was significant, though, and the main reason is this. Deflation, although as I've said, is not always a bad thing. If prices fall, that does sometimes mean that the economy is more productive, that things are being produced more efficiently, and of course that things are cheaper. However, the thing about deflation that doesn't work is that it basically cuts off credit. And the reason is because nobody wants to borrow money. I mean, think about it. If you have inflation, like you basically do in Turkey almost constantly now, inflation running at the latest estimates, 10% a year, roughly. Well, borrowing money is not such a big deal, right? If you can borrow it at a good rate, if you can borrow money at like 5% and inflation is running at 10%, it's almost like they're giving you money. Now, ideally, you don't want the numbers to be split in quite such an extreme way. I mean, you want it to be sort of controllable. Inflation is sort of like a monster. It's like you don't want the monster to get out of control. But that said, deflation, it almost does kill off the business cycle in the sense that people don't want to borrow money at all. And so businesses, they can't borrow money to invest in new plant machinery. Maybe they won't even produce at all. Because after all, why would you want to produce things or sell them if you may want to sell them now if prices are going to be worse later, but you're not going to want to kind of invest and produce more in the future, right? So deflation, if it gets to be that bad, is obviously going to depress economic activity, as it did. So that this may have been the most significant thing FDR did. Weirdly, it was like unremarked at the time. People barely even noticed it because they're publicizing all of these other things. But that probably was the most significant thing he did. Britain had gone off the gold standard even earlier. They went off in 1931. Now, you may remember there was a big argument about when they went on to the gold standard in 1925. Churchill was behind that. Keynes had been vociferously critical of that. So at least on this thing, Keynes does seem to have been vindicated by the evidence, that he was probably right about that Britain going on to the gold standard, particularly at the rate that they went on it, 4.86, if you remember, dollars to the pound, that this was probably a big mistake, and that when they went off, you can kind of see here, they went off about 1931. The economy flattened out for a while, but then did finally begin to recover. Now, the recovery, though, as I have said, it's one thing to recover from the trough. It's another thing to try to actually get back to where you were before. And in that case, again, the recovery was fairly weak. In fact, if you look at as late as like 1937, this is in the US, unemployment was still 14%. And then it shot back up to almost 20% in 1938, which wasn't that much lower than it was at like the worst Hoover year. In 1932-33, it had sort of topped out at about 26%. So even 5 years later, it wasn't all that much better. You had the same phenomenon you had under Hoover, where there were a lot of people benefiting from the government programs, but there were a lot of people still out of work, basically because the economy had not fully recovered yet. And the reason this stuff matters a lot is, again, it's not just that it literally led to Keynes publishing this book, to the creation of the Bretton Woods system, and we're going to talk about that in the coming weeks, right? The IMF and the World Bank and all these institutions designed to stabilize the world economy. But it literally does. These arguments, affect our lives in profound ways today. I told you already a little bit about Ben, I call him Helicopter Bernanke. Now, like most chairmen of the Federal Reserve, he's a student of the Great Depression. It is, after all, the classic subject of economic history. So basically, his big, I call it a bugaboo, because for these days, it's the thing you want to avoid, right, is deflation. He gave a famous speech in October of 2002. Long time ago, probably, in your lives. It was actually right about the time I arrived in Turkey, oddly enough. It was, about 5 months before the Iraq War, which obviously concentrated people's minds in that area. So it wasn't that well noticed at the time. It became, though, significant in retrospect, because the housing bubble, which I'm sure you heard about, which developed and then burst a couple of years ago, was largely the result of Bernanke's loose monetary policies. That is, running interest rates down virtually to zero, and then eventually doing what he calls, again, quantitative easing. Now, what does quantitative easing mean? I explained it a little bit the other day, but I'm not sure if I gave you a precise picture of what it actually is. The Japanese tried this, actually, after their own collapse in 1990. Basically, what it means is this. Bernanke, being essentially a Keynesian, even though he's a little more sophisticated than some, believes that the government should do everything it can to avoid deflation. That is, when there is a recession. There was a big recession after 2001. Well, 9/11 obviously had something to do with it, although some of it also went back to the previous bubble, which was like high technology and the internet. So they did not want the recession to turn into a depression. Supposedly, again, this is what they think happened in the Great Depression. So first, they lower the interest rates, to, again, make it easier to borrow money to stimulate the economy. But you get to a point where it's not working. And here's where Keynesian theory almost breaks down. If interest rates, like they did in Japan in the 1990s, go to virtually zero, and in fact, for a while in Japan, they were actually negative. They were like paying you to take their money, the banks, with government support, obviously. And yet the economy still doesn't rebound. Then what do? It's like you've run out of tricks, in a way, right? You've tried everything. Well, then what you do is you print money. And so that's basically what this is. It's a little more sophisticated than what FDR did. People supposedly know a little more now than they did then. I don't know if they're wiser. But what they basically do is this. They don't just print money and throw it out on the streets. That's the idea of the helicopter, right? You dump money from helicopters and people just pick it up and spend it. I mean, frankly, that might make more sense than what Bernanke has actually been doing. What he has actually been doing is printing money and loaning it to the government. So this explains why the bond market has not yet gone completely kerplooey. That is, U.S. Treasuries right now, if you've got a deficit of, as I've said, Obama's projected deficit for this year is 1.7 trillion. Now, last year's was about 1.5 trillion. The outstanding debt is about to crash through 14 trillion, which is the size of gross domestic product. In other words, it's about to crash through 100%. So everyone thinks, and everyone has been saying for a couple of years, well, at some point the proverbial excrement will hit the fan, right? And people will no longer buy debt, or the interest rates will have to rise. That is, to borrow money, the U.S. will have to pay more. Well, the reason it hasn't happened yet is because most of this debt is not being bought by investors. It's not being bought even by the Chinese, famously, who have been, buying U.S. treasuries. It's being bought by Ben Bernanke with money that he created out of thin air. Basically, 70% of U.S. bonds being issued right now by the government are simply being bought by the U.S. Treasury. In other words, they're printing money and loaning it to themselves. Now, how long can that go on? No one knows. The point here being, again, he learned a lesson about the Great Depression. Supposedly it's about the gold standard. It's about banks not having enough flexibility. If the economy, if you have deflation, that is, you want to prevent deflation, you want to prevent the economy from turning into a depression. And so in order to do that, you lower interest rates, and then if that doesn't work, you print money, which is what FDR actually did. Only, of course, $3 billion. As much as that was, is nothing like what Ben Bernanke is doing right now, which is printing about $1 trillion. So at some point, obviously, things are going to go south. What FDR did may very well have made sense in 1933. However, he set some dangerous precedents. I'll give you an example of what I mean. He went off gold, as I've said, in 1933. Some of you have some economic background. You know that the U.S. also went off gold again in a later year. Do you know when? kind of famous episode. Basically, the Bretton Woods system was blown up. In what year? Under what president? Do people know? Okay, well, we'll cover that this term. But it was 1971. Richard Nixon basically went off the gold standard. And this is partly because he was trying to inflate the economy like most presidents do, because, again, he wanted to stimulate economic growth. What this basically meant is that you could no longer turn in your dollars for gold at $35 an ounce. He did just like FDR did, that is, he wanted the price of gold to float. Well, when FDR did it, the price of gold rose from, somewhere around like $28 or $30 an ounce. It rose up to $35, and then it stabilized. When Nixon did it in 1971, whether this was the cause of the stagflation of the 70s or not, the Arab oil embargo might have had something to do with it. Gold went from $35 an ounce in 1971, the fixed price, with all other currencies pegged to the dollar. It went to about $980 by 1980. If any of you have been following the gold market right now, do you know where gold is today? You might know the gram price or the kilogram price, or like Sherek Altana. Well, I'll tell you, the ounce price right now is slightly over $1,400. Okay? So, adjusted for inflation, it's lower than it was in 1980. But here's the issue then. You can manipulate the economy. FDR did it possibly with some success. However, you're playing with fire if you're printing money, if you're speculating against your own currency. I mean, that's what FDR was doing when he was buying gold. He was literally speculating against the dollar. Now, it's interesting that almost all central banks do this. Turkey did this a couple of months ago. They decided they wanted exports to be more competitive, and so they decided to put some downward pressure on the Turkish lira. Yeah, it all works to some extent. Bankers do have an impact on the economy. The problem is, again, they are playing with fire, and they don't always understand what they do. I mean, that's really the big question today in the global economy. Does Ben Bernanke know what he's doing? I mean, I hope he does. I hope I'm wrong to be skeptical about it. I hope that it'll turn out more like it did in the 1930s. That is, that it will ward off deflation and maybe gently reflate the economy. However, the debt levels right now are so extreme. The gold price is a reflection, obviously, of a lack of confidence in the dollar. This is the problem. That, like, the interpretation of the Great Depression ends up leading to these kinds of policies. They're all based on the interpretation of past events. I mean, that's why economic history is so important. Politicians, central bankers, they all have their interpretation. And there may not be one correct interpretation of the Great Depression, both its origins and its consequences. But you should understand the different interpretations because they help explain, the different behavior. Just one more term I'm going to throw out. We'll come back to it later in the term. This is the idea of stagflation. This is associated with the 1970s. What happened, that is, after the U.S. went off the gold standard. Eventually, the U.S. had inflation running at 20%. I mean, that's pretty extreme. 20% means you can barely plan your expenses for the next year. 20% means you want to basically buy oil and hold it, or buy real estate and hold it. You want to borrow money, so that people who are able to borrow money can make a killing. People, on the other hand, who can't borrow money, they're really in trouble. I mean, inflation usually transfers money from the poor to the rich because the rich are able to manipulate the currency markets. Well, here's the thing. According to the orthodox theory, the general theory of Keynes, it was like, inflation and unemployment were supposed to be in some kind of a, relation. The one thing went up and the other thing went down, right? Inflation, that is, excessive government printing, also interest rates, government stimulus. This was all supposed to lead to economic growth, which would reduce unemployment. And then once unemployment got down to a certain level, then you were supposed to pull off. You're supposed to allow things to stabilize. The problem was in the 1970s that didn't happen. The economy stagnated, that is, stopped growing, and then went into negative growth, and you had inflation. That's kind of the worst situation of all. Because people are out of work, the economy is not churning along, and yet you have this inflation which is eating into everything. I mean, it was really serious in the late 70s. Really did seem like apocalypse to a lot of people in the Western world. So the late 70s almost repeated some of the worst aspects of the Depression. The one difference was that in the Depression you had deflation. We have not had deflation since. And the reason is because all the central bankers and economists learned this lesson too well, that is, that you don't want deflation. So that basically means we all now have to live with inflation. for good and for ill. We hope they keep it under control. I mean, here in Turkey, what, 2001, 2002, you guys were pretty young then, but yeah, 2001, that was the real crash. Obviously, when things get that bad, then you're in trouble. So central bankers, that's the thing, is they all have their ideas, and sometimes they improve matters, but they're playing with fire when you play with the currency's value. I mean, that in the end, the arguments of the people who said they should have stayed in the gold standard, again, they're discredited now. No one wants to go back to the gold standard, supposedly. It's only the cranks who do. But the one good thing about the gold standard was it prevented politicians from printing money. Now, politicians can print pretty much as much money as they want. Bernanke, he literally said this in his 2002 speech. He said, the US government can create dollars at no cost to itself. They can literally create dollars. Doesn't cost a thing. It's just the printing press. When most countries do that, you get hyperinflation right away. The US, though, has certain advantages because it's like the last market, the biggest market in the world. Also because people around the world hold dollars. The Chinese hold a huge hoard of dollars and securities, and they don't want to get rid of them. So this allows the US to get away with it in a way other countries can't, but only up to a point. So I'm not sure where we are right now. I mean, history never repeats itself exactly. We're not in 1932, certainly. On the other hand, we might be close to where we were in the 1970s, when you had stagnation and oil shock and massive inflation. We could be actually closer to the 1970s now than the 1930s, in part because, again, people learned the lesson of the 1930s. And whenever people learn a lesson, they learn it so well that they never forget it, and then they never learn anything new. They just keep repeating the same thing they think they know. Well, I hope I haven't made it more confusing. It's a very complex topic, and I'm expecting all of you could maybe take a stab at it in, let's say, on the midterm if you want to. But the thing you should remember is there's no one right answer. Everyone has an argument, everyone has a theory. There's a lot of evidence that supports certain theories but not others. It's very complicated. But if any of you are interested in finance and economic history, this is a great subject, and you should come to see me because there are some good books that I can recommend. I think that's all I had for today. Briefly about the quizzes, I'm aiming for Wednesday, but I will definitely have them by next Friday. So I think if I have only some of them done Wednesday, I'll just wait till Friday so everyone gets them at the same time. I hope you can wait that long. And so anyway, for next week then, we will begin with Stalin, and if we have time, we'll do Hitler too, Hitler's rise to power.